Okay, so everyone should have a Postman account now. Everyone should be signed in. And we've already talked a bit about it. It's essentially an application that is used for testing and developing APIs. We're also going to throw in curl because I believe it has been mentioned. And I added a challenge that will let you run through some APIs themselves with both curl and Postman. You'll get to choose, just do one of each or more if you want. And what you're going to do is you'll write out your curl commands in a text document, a markdown or a TXT document, and then you could toss those inside of the solutions directory. You'll then do the same thing for Postman, but instead of copy pasting your requests, you'll be saving them inside of a collection, and then you could export them as a single JSON file. So that's the easiest way to export out of Postman, and we'll cover that in a sec. I'm going to switch over, though, first to curl. Well, APIs in general, and then curl. So let me make sure I'm sharing the right screen. I thought it was sharing the entire desktop, but it's not. Okay. Got a lot of windows to try and move out of here. Okay. All right, APIs. APIs are application programming interfaces, and in a nutshell, they're essentially some kind of like intermediary connection between you, the client, and the application. So an analogy for that would be you go into a restaurant and you letting the waiter know what you want to. This does not look right. Oh, wait, no, it is right. It's just a different order. Yeah, so the kitchen would be the server, and the waiter would be the API that brings your request, the client's request, back to the kitchen for them to serve something up for you. Also, if you think back to like 1950s when there were like switchboard operators, telephone operators, you dial a number and they'll route you to the right person or the right line. That's another analogy that could somewhat represent APIs. And so far, you've learned about HTML, CSS, and DOM, which allows you to manipulate HTML and CSS within a browser. Now, all of that right now is internal. It's limited to your machine. With APIs, you can interact externally, however. APIs allow you to interface with other systems, and you do this through HTTP requests that also utilize URLs. So we already know that HTTP is a hypertext transfer protocol. We use it to navigate the web, and we use URLs, universal remote locators, to let the browser know where to find the information we want to grab. And when working with APIs, it's not so different from just having a link that you toss into a browser address bar. But instead of tossing it in the address bar, you'll be using a number of ways to interact with it, the URL and the endpoint. You could use curl, like we've talked about, which is a very lightweight tool for interacting with APIs straight out of your terminal. You could use Postman, which we've just set up accounts for, and that we'll be demoing in a second here as well. And you can use JavaScript. We'll be going over JavaScript fetch, which allows you to programmatically interact with APIs. When you hear about APIs, you'll probably hear of them being referred to in a few different ways: HTTP APIs or HTTP requests versus REST APIs. And there's not too big of a difference. You could think of HTTP APIs being like a language, whereas REST is a dialect of that language. Because really what REST APIs are is it's more of a practice. It's RESTful APIs. And the idea is you follow some more nuanced and specific protocol. So a basic HTTP API will be very flexible, no strict guidelines, and you'll have a variety of formats that you could output your data in. And when we switch over to a more RESTful practice, we're really just building on top of that already existing HTTP API. We're just following RESTful principles in addition to that. And some of these principles include reduction of redundancy, cleanliness of code, consistency, legibility, things like that. So the things that you would expect out of a set of principles that are, I don't know, coding or programming related, right? We want to be dry. We want to be easily understandable, which just makes it easier for different devs to come in and pick up where another dev left off, or to understand how an API might work. It's especially important to be following RESTful APIs, like let's say in an internal setting in an organization, right? You're building APIs for other programmers in your organization to use. It just makes sense to make them as easy to use as possible. So what would that look like in terms of syntax? On the left, we have some examples of like some bare bones HTTP endpoints. This is primarily what we'll be interacting with today. I don't think any of the APIs we're going to play around with are going to be too robust. And so you'll have this syntax where at the end of an endpoint, there may be some kind of a instruction or action followed by this question mark, which is allowing the browser to know that this URL endpoint request is also passing in a parameter, in this case, an ID. So you could see that there is a bit of redundancy here because not only are we having these specific instructions, but there's also the feature, the method of the request behind that. Get is your simple fetch request. It's purely for grabbing information, and there is no data manipulation involved. Very similar to a select in a P-SQL query. And then we have post, which allows you to insert data. So very similar to insert in SQL. And we have put and patch, which are very similar. But there is one difference. Well, they're both update actions. The difference being put will allow you to update an entire row of data, whereas patch will allow you to update a specific column in that row. So just one piece of data. And then we have delete, which allows you to remove data. So when we're working with just bare bones HTTP APIs, this is the syntax you'll see. There's a redundancy because you're repeating the action of the feature in the command in the URL itself, right? Whereas with a RESTful API, there is an extra layer of effort made by the developers to give it clarity. And so REST APIs tend to be more resource focused versus action focused. Users have been set up to be a resource in this API, for example. These various methods allow you to interact with the user's database or table in different ways. And this gives the different commands more consistency because we know that we know exactly what we're hitting and what we should be getting. And all we're really doing between these is hitting the same endpoint in slightly different ways, passing in a different body, for example, and passing in a different request. We'll see all of that, especially when we get to Postman. You could do the same thing in curl, making requests, making different kinds of requests by passing in an option. Okay, cool. All right, any questions so far?
Yeah, what was the difference between patch and put?
Oh yeah, sure. Put lets you update an entire row of data. So you have first name, last name, address for a user. You get to update all of that in one go. Whereas with patch, you you have the option of like picking and choosing what you want to update.
Got it. Thank you.
Mhm. Okay. Perl, which is short for client URL, is a command line tool used to transfer data to in between machines. And fun fact, it was originally known as CURL, which because it allows you to see a URL, but its creator then later revised it to be client. And we've already talked about curl a bit and what its advantages are. It's fast, it's lightweight, like you get to just run curl straight out of your terminal. And that is its primary advantage. It's also, let me actually move this over because I don't have access to my terminal from here. So let's get this in here. Let's get this preview in here. Okay. So now I can access my terminal and we can try running some curl commands. Feel free to follow along. These are very simple requests. We'll be hitting mock database. There's going to be several actually inside of the challenge. There are several examples that you could use. For this curl exercise, we're going to hit something called recres.in. It's a simple mock API mocking tool. And basically, if we were to hit this endpoint, these endpoints are already built out, right? Because it's like a mocking tool. These endpoints are designed to return some kind of data just so you get to see, it gets to simulate for you what different methods, how different methods will behave. So in this case,
Before we keep going, is this document posted anywhere? Because I'm in the repo and going through the repo, but obviously you have a different document. So
Yeah, I was about
yeah,
to ask the same thing.
yeah, well, we're not following along with your 2025 cohort lesson notes. At least I'm not, 'cause I can't find it.
yeah, it's kind of like just my slide deck. I
Okay.
can share it as a guest just later on if you want.
All right.
Okay. I mean, do the other instructors usually share their slide decks?
I mean, that's one of the issues that, I mean, at least I put in there is the media content that you use for your instructional purposes. All we have access to is the repo.
Hmm.
And it's hard to follow along with something you guys have if we don't have access to it. I guess the PowerPoints are somewhere, but I still can't find them. You know, I don't know. It's just been an issue for me to try and take notes and keep up at the same time. If I don't have the stuff I can like refer back to while you're still teaching.
Yeah, I don't think the other instructors use PowerPoints, and if they do just use code, they'll copy and paste their code. But for the most part, they'll use the lecture notes because that's what we have access to.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. No, that makes sense. When I was looking at the lecture notes today, though, they were just really, or the repo, it was just really light. Like there's,
Yeah, that's what I was asking. I like everything you're showing us. I don't have it.
okay. Yeah, let me see. Let me grab this first part here then. And yeah, like I said, I'll put the rest in just later on. So like maybe we could just grab the code right now that we can copy paste. Right. I'm gonna Slack this. Okay. Ooh. Right, it's straight up from a markdown thing, so the syntax is kind of funky. It'll look a lot better in the just later on, but yeah, now you could at least copy paste some of these curl commands and URLs while you all have a chance to look through that and get your screen set up the way that you need so that you can copy and paste these easily into your terminal. Let's just take a quick look at what RecRes looks like. So it's a hosted REST API ready to respond to your AJAX requests. Not necessarily AJAX, it doesn't have to be AJAX. It could just be, as we're seeing now, interaction through curl. So I've said already that there are different ways to interact with API endpoints. There's curl, Postman, other applications like Insomnia, and within JavaScript even or other languages, there are different libraries that you could use, right? We're going over fetch because it's the built-in library, but then there are other ones available like Axios, Ajax. We're not going to get into those at all during the cohort, I think. They might be mentioned here and there for you to explore if you're curious. But for the most part, fetch will service just fine. And fetch is actually, depending on what you're working with, a standard. Like if you are familiar with Next.js, the developers of Next.js chose to work with fetch. Let's see. Okay, cool. So that's RecRes. It just gives us like some of these basic API endpoints to hit. And if you notice, I'm ramping my URL inside of double quotations because I think in a Zeech environment, the shell will not like the question mark and it's going to throw it off. So if I pass it in as a string, oh, that's not the response I thought I'd be getting. What am I missing? Oh, no. Let's see. Coming soon. Why is it saying coming soon? That first URL might be wrong because the second one looks like it's working. It's giving us a row of data where the email is Janet Weaver. It's exactly what we see here, right? We have data and a nested object with an ID of 2, an email, first name, last name. This was supposed to give us an entire sheet of data objects. Not sure why. Not sure why it's not. That's an interesting message. It's like giving us this HTML wrapper. That's really weird. Oh yeah, look, I see. I see. There's a typo in my. There's a typo wasn't there. We're missing a Q. We're missing a Q. Okay, so let me fix. Oh no, we're missing an R. Yeah. Now we have move permanently response from Cloudflare, and it's probably because I took out the S from HTTPS. Okay, so with the endpoint spelled correctly with no missing characters, we get an entire group cluster of results. We have a page basically of data, and per page we have 6 rows of data. And I guess there are a total of 2 pages. We've only pulled page 1, but this shows us that there are 12 users total. Okay. So like we've talked about, there are different types of requests that you can make, right? And with a GET request, it's a very simple interaction. You're just retrieving data. And depending on how an API is built, you should usually have the functionality to choose to pull several pieces of data or just a single piece of data. But ultimately, it boils down to how the developers design the APIs. You'll see a lot of this yourself firsthand as we progress through the curriculum, because we'll be revisiting APIs again with frameworks like Django later on. And within Django, you'll be writing your own API endpoints. So you'll really get to see then how flexible these can become. Post, like I said earlier, is a type of request that allows you to insert data.
So the curl command, I'm still trying to keep up here. The curl command with the URL attached as the what you're passing into it will output whatever that endpoint's JSON file, if it has a JSON file associated with the API, to your terminal, correct?
Exactly, yes.
Okay, because I was trying to keep up and run it in my VS Code, and it was saying no match found. I think I missed some of the typos or whatever, but okay, I just want to make sure I'm understanding what the curl command is doing.
Okay. Were you able to get either of them to run?
No, it just keeps telling me no match found. I am using ZSH as well.
No match found. Is anybody else getting that?
No, mine's working.
Hey, you wanna do you want to troubleshoot real quick? Do you want to share a screenshot?
Yeah, it's probably just something done by because
Okay, let's see.
there's I think I do that. See, I copied it straight from your Slack that you posted, and it said
Mhm.
no match found. And then I was trying to like stick with you in terms of like changing what I thought were different from me. So I took out the S and I put in the 1, and it's still saying no match found. So I don't know if I'm doing something correct here.
Try. Oh, yeah, you are in Siege. I don't know. Try well, try the remove the quotations and remove the page parameter. So just yeah, it'll just end at endpoint or sorry, user.
Get rid of the like that.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay. And then from there, if you do question mark and then whatever is going to point to whatever data you want, right? So per page, question mark per page, which should be whatever this is.
Mm-hmm.
Correct. Okay.
Let's try with the parameter again, but with single quotations. or single quotes.
Why is it doing that? Why is it? I don't know why it's not just putting in the question mark.
Is it like automatically escaping it?
Yeah. Oh, there we go.
Yeah, you
That's
might have
weird.
some like,
Something within ZSH that's doing that.
yeah.
Page one. And then you said single quotes, right?
Mhm.
Mhm.
But you know what it was doing should work too. But yeah, let's try that.
Huh.
Cool. So it looked like your terminal was auto escaping the special characters. So
Yeah, I mean, it wasn't doing it for. Okay. It won't go to the other one. Huh. It wasn't doing it for these ones up here. I don't know why.
because
The
they're
copy
different
paste.
quotes, I think. I mean, I don't
Oh,
know
okay.
what you're using in your terminal to do that. It's pretty cool, I think. But yeah, try it out. Try typing that question mark again.
Yeah.
Okay. So you know that backslash, leave that in there. You want that in there.
To do
When
that and then run it.
with a page equals 1, yes.
Huh. Okay.
So this backslash, it's an escape symbol when you're working with like HTML URLs or yeah, like URLs or anything like that. And there are special characters, different interpreters and compilers and applications may interpret this differently. And so in that case, something like a backslash will escape it, which basically tells whatever interpreter it's being passed to not treat it like a special character.
Okay. So my problem was I didn't need double quotes.
Right, exactly.
That was the problem. Okay.
Yeah, but I don't know how you have your environment set up that you don't need that. Look, definitely looks like you
Yeah.
have some bells and whistles that
I didn't really, from what I remember, I didn't really copy anything new for ZSH. I just, whatever its basic update, it does.
yeah, that's interesting.
I'll have to look.
Maybe a VS Code extension then?
No, I'll have to look into it later. I don't want to take up time.
Yeah, sure. But yeah, that's pretty cool.
Sweet.
Like to yeah, if you do find out where that's coming from, I'd like to know.
Okay.
Okay, cool. So we've looked at get requests, and this isn't even a great example because unfortunately this mock API isn't very robust. It's not really it doesn't have persistent data. So like if we were to create this user, we won't really be able to delete it because it doesn't really exist. So one way we can also look at that though is if we try to grab this exact same user, which doesn't exist, it should return an empty piece of data. So as of right now, Morpheus does not exist. But if we were to create him, we get a response saying that he was created. Again, I don't think the data persists. So even if I were to do that, yeah. We'll see with a different mock API later on the persistence of data that we create. But for now, let's just talk about the options that are being passed into curl here. We see with -x, we're able to specify, and let me make this bigger just in case it's too small to see. We're able to specify the kind of request we want to make. So we want to make a post request, and then we're also passing in a header. When you have a request, there's actually several components to it. You have your header, your body, and there are different ways to pass in parameters, and we'll go over that a bit more later on in the JavaScript section. But right now, we want to specify that the content type we're passing in is JSON. And that allows us then to pass in this body object as simple JSON. And then we specify the endpoint that we want to hit, which is, again, just users. So with that, we're able to create air quotes, a user named Morpheus. And we at least see with this response that it was a successful request. And if we want to update a specific user, so let's grab user 2 again, who is Janet Weaver. Let's now put in a put request to update this user. And I'm just going to copy this part. So where's Janet's job? I guess Janet doesn't have a job. It looks like there's an ID. There's a first name, last name. Okay, let's go ahead and just change her last name instead. Let's pretend she changed her name to something like, I don't know, Smith. And then we pass in the URL and the endpoint. And there is a quote that I'm missing somewhere. Where is that? Let's see it. Here's my double quote. Close that double quote, single quote. Okay, I'm missing a single quote. So that's not going to work. So let me retype that. Says I'm still missing a quote. I'm just going to copy paste this. Okay, so it updated the data object so that instead of a first name, last name, she has a name and a job. And I don't know how I mistyped my command. But we see that an update will, or a put request will allow us to update the entire row. Yeah, I really wish we were working with a better API right now. Let's look at the delete. Yeah, because the data persists, it's not like we're not really getting to see the difference between put and patch because, well, let's try this anyway. So, right, the reason why this is a bad example is, well, first off, she had like entirely different parameters. I'm just noticing now, like she had a first name, last name, and for whatever reason, this mock API is not robust enough to return an error when we pass in the wrong data. That's what we really should be seeing. But in this case, it allowed us to pass in a name and a job key, and that, well, key value pair, and that did go through with the update. We were able to update multiple values at once, and sorry, with the put, and then with the patch, we were able to update just a single piece of information, which is her job. Now let's see if we can delete this. Again, I don't know if it's going to persist, but let's try it. So Right. When I'm saying like the data doesn't persist, this mock PI isn't really designed to, I guess, store. We're not actually updating a real database, right? So when we go to get this user again, there's all her original information. So if we run this delete command, we're probably going to get the same thing. It's going to give us a response that at least simulates the delete, which is an empty response, but then I'm pretty sure we'll be able to grab her again. Yep. So this is how you run these curl commands. We'll play with a better API in a bit so we could actually see the repercussions of using some of these commands, like changing the actual data. Here we have a quick comparison table for put versus patch. Again, mostly you are able to overwrite an entire record or just parts of a record. And then there are API tokens. APIs, because they are essentially, well, they are programming interfaces. They are gateways into another application's functions as methods. Sometimes we don't want to just give out free access willy-nilly, right? So then you'll be required to register so this application and their developers can have your information and spam your email inbox. But then they'll also give you an API key, which you can use to actually interact with their API. So you can do this if you want. It's not crucial, but what that would look like. Is this not the right URL? Okay. Yeah, I'm accustomed to that. Weather API. Change that before I copy it over as a gist. So free weather API. Like I was saying, some APIs will require you to register. In this case, I should have already registered last night. So where is the login button? Maybe my account? Okay, yeah. And once you register with an API like this, you'll get a username, you'll get a way to sign in. And once you're signed in, somewhere inside of your dashboard should be an API key. So this is my API key, and copy that. I can then use it in my curl request. And oh, look, it looks like I've already got it in here. So if I were to try this without key, let's see what happens. I get an error code telling me that I am missing my API key. So let's try passing that in instead. And then we get a successful response. So that's just something to note. Some places will require you to register, and in exchange, they'll give you an API key, access to their APIs. Okay. So this is essentially the lab, or sorry, the challenge. You'll be running through both curl and what is it called? Postman API. So let's go ahead and switch over to Postman now, and we'll start running through some basic requests. Okay. Okay, cool. We can see this. Here we have Postman. I am signed in. And when I sign in, I'm able to see in the interface different things like different collections, different environments, a history of the different requests that I've called, and more, depending on how you configure your work bar. You know how I mentioned earlier that we want to save our requests inside of a collection? That's what this tab is. So if I were to create a new request in this collection, I would just go up here to new. I would select an HTTP request. And I will then, let's see, what should we use? Yeah, let's just use the placeholder for now. I'm gonna hit this placeholder URL and endpoint. This is just another mock API tool. This is JSON placeholder. Let's see what that looks like. One other thing that I think I haven't mentioned yet about APIs is because they are essentially, I don't know how to describe that. Because they're made to be interacted with externally, they'll pretty much always come with documentation. And if it's got good documentation, it should be easy to follow and easy to use as a result. If we go to the JSON placeholder website, we see what it is. We've got a splash page that tells us what it is. It's a free, fake, and reliable API for testing and prototyping, powered by their server and low database, whatever that is. And wow, looks like they're serving quite a lot of requests every month. Got some sponsors. They want potentially new sponsors. And they give us an example of how to use it. So here we see the fetch syntax. This is what we'll be using later on. Now, we're in Postman, right? So I don't necessarily want all of this. Copying all of this isn't going to help me inside of Postman. All I need is the URL and endpoint. So if I grab that, I can toss it in here and give it a shot. So hitting send, it shows us in the bottom part of this window the response. And so it's letting us know that it found user ID 1 in the to-dos endpoint. The name of this to-do is Delectus Autumn. I don't know if I pronounced that right at all. And then it has not been completed. Let's try it with 5. And it gives us something else. Now, once you've tested an endpoint and you like it, you could actually hit save up here and it will save it to the collection and you can name it whatever you want. So let's say JSON placeholder to-dos. And now we could see a new request added to the selection. And just like we were doing with curl, you could change the type of request that you want to create. So in this case, we've got a post request instead of a get request. And we're going to be hitting this posts endpoint that will allow us to create new posts. So let's say 6, 7, 8, 9. Let's hit send. And we have a new post using 6, 7, 8, 9. Okay, I mentioned using or trying out a different what is it? API. Let's see if we could just do that right now. Okay, so there are other tools like mockapi.io that allow you to even mock your own database, right? So in here, I signed up. It's a free account. I'm using my free resource. I get to create resources. So if I wanted to, oh, I've reached my limit apparently. Let me delete that because it's empty. And now I should be able to make a new one. Here, because it's like a mock tool, you could just basically make this whatever you want. So let's say, I don't know, let's do foods. I'm gonna make a foods endpoint. Foods are gonna have a name, and I don't know, we'll have a calorie count maybe. And the way this specific tool works is you get to select whether you want to like have mocked data or just the data type. So if I were to do, because I'm pretty sure there aren't going to be like any foods in here. Oh, there's images. I'm going to do a string, and that's going to populate these values with empty strings. And then I'm also going to do a number for the calories, and it's food, so it doesn't need avatars, but I guess.
Julius.
Yeah.
I have a question. Is this what we're looking at scheme, is this like the representation of what's in the database?
Yes, exactly.
Okay.
So yeah, it's kind of like a simplified way of creating a schema though, right? So it's really just for mocking purposes. And if we scroll down, we'll see that various endpoints can be enabled or disabled. And so we just because we want to play around with all of these, we're going to go ahead and create all of them. So if I create that and then I copy paste this URL, I can change the endpoints. Let me make a new request. Now, if I hit the foods endpoint without that colon, was it food or foods? I named food for some reason. If I hit get, it's going to return empty because we actually haven't populated it yet. It's a super easy tool. What I'm going to do here is I'm going to like slide this up to 20. Maybe that's too much. I'm going to slide this up to 6. And it says data generated. So now we have data. It should be empty. And if we hit send again, now we actually get some responses. So it looks like it mocked out the calories for us, but it didn't really give us any creative names. So let's try doing an update. So first thing we want to do if we're updating is switch our method, right? So we want to do a puts. We're going to do a puts on foods, and we're going to go back to our documentation and see if it explains to us how to use this API. So if I were to scroll down to wherever it showed the APIs, this is typically what you would see inside some documentation. It shows you the endpoint, and then it shows you a value that you might want to pass in. So if I set this to get, and then I pass in an ID, so let's say an ID of 5, it returns just that single food item. Now this tells me if I want to add foods, I just hit the foods endpoint again, but with a post request. Nothing else. I don't need to update anything else or add anything else, I should say. But if I want to update a piece of information, again, I'm going to pass in that ID with the put method. So let's go to, let's see the first one, and let's try. Okay, so as we can see, we're not really updating anything, but if we were to add a parameter, let's say name equals apple. One cool thing about Postman is as you add parameters, it will automatically create them in here as well. These are query parameters. I mentioned earlier that there are multiple ways to pass data in. And again, we'll see more of that in the JSON, JavaScript fetch portion. But here, the syntax we're using, the question mark followed by the parameter, that's just a query parameter. And so if we send this, let's see, did it actually update? No, it did not. I might want us to, oh, well, no, that's the idea. Yeah, I might want us to, pass it in through the body, but it's not actually telling us how it wants us to pass it in. So we'll have to do a bit of documentation digging to see if there's anything a little more specific. All right, code examples. Let's see what they have for put. Yeah. Okay, it tells us that for a put request, it wants a payload and it's going to return a response of that task. All right, we'll see.
Julius,
Yeah, what's up?
so I've been thinking about what you were saying that is a database. So in the API, it's accessing the data that's in a database. So is the API sending the SQL commands in the backend to get this data?
Yes, exactly. So
Okay.
what we're hitting right now is an endpoint, right? And so when you're developing your own API or application with APIs, you're going to be creating a few things. One, you create the endpoint or whatever method or component will interact with that endpoint or listen for requests to that endpoint, I should say. And then it will be associated with a route, and that will go to another function in the application that makes that SQL request, just like you said.
Okay.
Those are the layers that you'll be seeing firsthand once you start making your own API endpoints. In this case, kind of a little confused as to how it wants us to pass in the information. And if we can't see how to do it in these stocks, and we'll just move on. Nation sorting. Yeah. I'm going to try this. I don't know if it's going to work because the documentation is not clear. I could try passing it in as a body as opposed to a parameter. So I'm going to delete this now. And I'm going to try setting this to Apple inside of the body. And here, when you're setting a body, you can select different types of syntax or formats for your body. In this case, I want to pass it in as a JSON because that's the format that it's been sent back to us, right? So I'm going to select raw, and then I'm going to select JSON, and then I'm going to try hitting send. And it looks like it updated. If we go to our mock API again, and we go to our data, we see that we now have an apple. So we were talking earlier about HTTP versus RESTful APIs. This is a more RESTful API. It wants us to pass in data a little more securely. Instead of having the parameters exposed in the URL, it wants us to pass it in as a body, which is not going to be visible to the URL. Okay, now we'll just demo patch. I mean, you see that we're able to update like all of the data inside of this request if we use put. Now, if we use patch and only pass in a single piece of information, I don't know how many calories an apple actually has, but let's just say 80. Now I'm going to send this request and let's see if it works. Okay, it just updated a single value. And that's the difference between puts and patch. I think if we tried to do this with put, let's see if it throws an error at us. It does not. Yeah, it accepts it anyway. We're able to just update that single value.
Then what would post do?
Oh, post allows you to add a new thing entirely. So let's see, we've got 6 items inside of our database right now. What am I doing? So if we wanted to add a seventh,
So, but you have to have all the data in there to use a post. Otherwise, would
Yeah.
it throw an error, I guess, or would it just remove the data that's currently there and replace it?
it depends on, again, like how the developers program their API, right? Best practice would be to, well, can't really, that's not really,
I'm just trying to discern the difference between post, put, and I think I understand patch pretty straightforward.
yeah, post is basically adding, it's basically an insert command. It's adding like a new piece of information. So if I run this, we see we only have 6 items in here. So if I also need to get rid of that, I think. Let me just check the documentation again. Post does not want us to pass in an ID. So I removed it from up here. And now I'm passing in the values I want inside of the body. So if I hit send, it gives us a response. So I'm going to assume that that was successful. I'm going to refresh, and we now have a 7th food item. It adds the banana. Now, what if I tried to do this with a put or a patch? It tells us that it's an invalid request. One of the reasons why is because this put endpoint was designed to accept an ID, and we're not passing in an ID, so it's not working.
So that's why understanding the documentation, so you understand how the commands are being utilized, is important.
Exactly.
Okay.
Exactly.
So every API is going to be different in that aspect.
Yes. I think one of the lessons earlier this week maybe mentioned something about how, as a programmer, 80% of your job is reading documentation and only 20% is programming. That stuck with me when I first went through Platoon. It's your mileage will vary, of course, depending on where you go, but the point is documentation is critical. Okay, if I try to send this, it tells us that it's not found because it doesn't exist, right? So we can't use put or post, or sorry, we can't use put or patch to add new data to the database or the table, because that's not what these requests are designed to do. We use post to insert new data. So if I try this again with patch, same thing. It's going to be not found. Now let's go back to the difference between patch and put, because this is interesting to me. It looks like the functionality is exactly the same between the two of these, right? And that might just be because the way the endpoints were designed, there is no functional difference. Yeah. If we look at these docs, we see that there's not even an endpoint for patch, right? So I think what's happening behind the scenes is patch requests are essentially just being treated as put requests. So again, to go back to the question of the difference between the two, the general difference is patch allows you to update just single values, whereas put will allow you to update an entire row of data. But it really depends on how that API was built and designed. And that's why reading the documentation is important. Okay.
So when you say update an entire row of data, does that mean every ID will update, like, for example, name, like every ID of name will be updated?
Right. Basically, if this was designed to be robust enough to specify the difference between put and patch, put will probably throw an error if you don't pass in all of the data. In this case, that's not happening because it's just a simple mock API.
But is it possible to update like the same property for every ID at the same time?
Oh yeah, I see what you're saying. Like multiple, yeah.
Yeah.
Let's see. With put and patch, in this case, no, because they require us to pass in an ID inside of the endpoint.
Okay.
Now that does make me wonder if we can add multiple items. This will probably fail. Because if the developers wanted us to have this functionality, they should specify it in the docs with an example of how to use it. So I think, like, I'm just kind of making up some syntax, right? Because the documentation doesn't actually tell us what format it wants these in. But I'm gonna try creating a list of objects. It's already kind of throwing this at me. Oh, right, because it would probably expect something like it's JSON, so it needs to have both a key and a value. And again, our documentation doesn't really tell us if it'll accept something like this. I guess the documentation is not great. It didn't even tell us like how to pass in data. Like we just figured it out on our own. So let's see if this works. Typically, if you are able to pass in multiple pieces of data, like to add 2 items to a row, for example. If you were sending it in as JSON, this is how you would do it, by having a list of different objects. Okay. So kind of not. All this really seemed to have done is it just added some new data to this object. So let's go to our API. Let's see what that looks like now. Just one. Yeah, it just added this to a single row. So this isn't a very robust API. We can't add multiple items to this database at once. And again, the behavior that you come across is going to vary depending on the API itself that you interact with. So today we have a challenge where you'll be going over both curl and Postman APIs. By the way, are there any questions on Postman? Were you all able to run some commands? Okay. I'm going to take that as a yes. And like I was saying, today's challenge, you get to interact with both curl and Postman, and there's a list of APIs to use here. You're not limited to these APIs. If you want, you can search for other free APIs. And look at that. There's a list of free APIs here. I'm gonna add this to the challenge because this is pretty cool. And then it tells us like some different aspects about these, right? Like it'll tell us if the API requires authorization or not. So if you don't want to give your information away to any of these, I don't know, APIs, then just choose ones that say no authorization. And HTTPS is basically HTTP with an extra layer of security. This tells us that it's a very simple service. That will give us a result like this, pictures of bears. But this isn't really giving us any information on how to make a request. So that's not so great. Let's see, it's probably gonna be the same thing. Looks like it might be. Oh no, this one gives us a bit more instruction. So this tells us that if we were to pass this in our browser, it downloads an image of a doggo. If the documentation isn't complete, you could usually just play around with the information that it does give you and figure out from there how to interact with it. So if we grab this URL, for example, and we just hit curl and we pass it in, let's see what happens. It tells us that it's complaining. So I think it probably wants us to pass in this I option. And now it just tells us a little more. Okay. One more thing I want to say about curl. It's because it's a terminal command that gives you access to help and the manual. So with help, I can see what all these various options are and what they do. And I could also type man for manual along with curl to learn a little more about it. So that's one other benefit of curl. You get access to its documentation and its options all out of your terminal. But yes, I'm going to add this to the README so you can play around with some of these APIs. You're not limited to this either. If you find more APIs outside of this, feel free to use that. Kind of been going longer than I wanted to, but any questions on anything so far?
You were putting -X in your curl command. What is that doing?
Oh, that's setting the request type. So that's where you pass in get, put, post, etc.
Raj.
Cool. All right. I'm going to open up breakout rooms. Y'all can take a 15-minute break, and I shared the schedule in Slack, so we will meet again at 1 o'clock Central.